We're going to start with an overview of Jane Roberts and channeling, and Seth, who's the main personality that she purports to channel. And then we're going to do a brief class exercise. We're going to split you into two groups. That's going to be short, though. And then after that, I think we're going to start with open discussion and then do the discussion leader partway through the class. So for context, I'm going to show a few clips from YouTube. So this first one is an interview with Jane Roberts and her husband, who, if you see on the cover of the book, it says that the cover image is done by, what's the name? Yeah, so that's Jane Roberts' husband.
Sorry. His name is Bob Butts.
So it's the two of them, because she would read, or she would be in trance saying stuff, and her husband would take notes in shorthand. So here is.
Coming to you from Elmira, New York, and we are really very, very honored and privileged to be able to be in the living room and the seminar room of one of the very most significant individuals on planet Earth that have had experiences with an altered state of consciousness, Miss Jane Roberts, who, along with her husband, Robert Butts, have been investigating over these past 10-odd years, if I'm correct. I'm not exactly sure, but approximately 10 years. Another state of consciousness than which we are normally accustomed to dealing with. I'd like to welcome you very, very much to the program, and I thank you very much for inviting me here to be able to talk to you. I wonder, perhaps, whoever, I'm not sure which one of you might like to pick up on it first, but there will be some people in the audience, believe it or not, although it's a pretty aware audience that watches this program, but there will be some people in the audience who aren't aware of the material, the Seth material. Could you maybe just give us a little bit of a background for a general audience of the means by which, in a general way, you came in contact with kind of consciousness and how it all got started?
Bob?
This began late in 1963. One evening, Jane was writing poetry after supper, as is her usual custom, and she went into an altered state of consciousness that was very unexpected by her. And she had an out-of-body experience. She found her consciousness leaving her body. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, she began to write in sort of an automatic script. Now, this experience lasted for over half an hour. And when Jane returned to her usual state of consciousness, she discovered that she produced this script called The Universe is Idea Construction.
This is in one evening?
In one evening, after supper. Mm-hmm. I was painting in my studio, and she was sitting out here. And I thought it was awfully quiet out here. Mm-hmm. And so I finally came out to see what she was so quiet about.
Yes.
And it was just at the end of this experience. She wasn't even able to use her voice to call me, to tell me what was going on.
Good heavens. Had anything like that happened to you before?
No, and actually it lasted a lot longer. It was well over an hour.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. No, I just, I've been a poet from the time I was a child, and writing. And the next thing I knew, my consciousness was just gone. And it wasn't in out of body in the respect that I had another body, or thought I did. My consciousness through like the window and then into the leaves and into everything. And it wasn't until I came back that I found this script and realized that, I had to have written it.
Yeah.
So now I'm going to show you a brief clip from one of her actual channeling experiences. So they don't unfortunately show the transition, but the beginning, when she's talking at herself, as herself, and then there's a break, and then she comes back, and then she's talking as Seth. So Seth was reportedly speaking to her.
Well, it was after the Seth material started, and this whole thing, before I realized that people You might use them or think of them as symbols, or you might, no matter how you relate to them, they have their own fantastic individuality. And whenever any beliefs, even our own, blind you to that, you have lost. Whenever you relate to someone as simply a belief, or you get your back up and you don't see their reality, then we've won. Will bring you closer to people. It will not divide you. If it divides you, that is not what it is. I bid you good evening.
How's it going?
See. Good evening.
And understand your responses to our friend here. For when he speaks, you fear the vocabulary. Because you fear the beliefs that you still are afraid of it.
And another clip of her actually channeling. That was, so you could tell when she was speaking as Seth versus speaking as herself. Her glasses come off. She has an accent, completely different intonation. So, and it's also somewhat like dramatic, as you'll see here.
They know if some of you are more serious people will forgive me, and I close my eyes so as not to embarrass you. They know that existence is fun. They realize that fun is good and joyful, and that the gods play. They recognize that through expressing their own reality, they form these atoms and molecules and cells, the reality that you think of as a physical body. The atoms within your toe do not stop and say, oh, I must be responsible and sober and form this toe.
So that's just to give you an idea.
She's speaking English?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know what you're saying?
No. The whole time?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was
She just
English.
speaking like I didn't even know what that accent was. Like,
Caribbean. Channeling is Jamaican.
how did she die?
I'm not actually sure. I just wanted to quickly read. This is an excerpt from this book, Channeling, by John Climo, Investigations on Receiving Information from Paranormal Sources. It's a really fun book because it's kind of like an overview of all the different kinds of channeling and how channeling became popular. But Jane Roberts and the Seth books were like massive in terms of getting the idea of channeling into like a wide audience. It's like very well known in New Age culture, but also other people. And like what was that book, The Secret, you were talking about? Like that is definitely influenced by channeled texts and the messages of them. So, I mean, because basically, before we talked about spiritualism and traditional mediumship, which is where you have dead people, dead relatives who communicate from the afterworld. But that kind of mediumship is different from this kind of channeling, which is more getting in touch with higher dimensional beings that are giving us information. So it's like in Flatland, if the square could go into trance and connect with the 3D sphere and get, information, if the sphere could talk through the square to other 2D shapes, like that's the equivalent of this kind of channeling. And they're often beings based in other star systems, beings who are group souls made up of multiple people. And then also some, like Seth as an entity, would it be later channeled by different people who claimed that it was the same Seth that she was speaking to. And there's been some interesting developments in terms of channeling and authorship, because as we'll look at the introduction to one of her channeled books where she talks about, because it says by Jane Roberts, but she says that she's getting it from this external source. So there have been cases where a channel will become well known for channeling a particular entity, and then someone else will come along and claim to channel the same entity, and then people will file copyright infringement against that person. But it's sort of like, because if they actually believe that it was an external person, why would you be filing copyright infringement against other people who are in touch with that person? It's like, I say that I talked to Christy on the phone over the weekend, and then Grace says, I talked to Christy on the phone, and I say, no, copyright infringement. Like, only one of us can be talking to Christy. So, so that's some of the ideas that's discussed in this book. But so here, and this is on page 28, like he has an introduction, and then Jane Roberts and the Seth books are at the beginning because she was so fundamental in the 70s and getting the idea of channeling and the sense of the significance of it. So I'm just going to read a few paragraphs here. We begin with the entity Seth that was said to come through the trance channel Jane Roberts. What does Seth have to tell us? He claims that we are not dependent on physical matter. We are multidimensional in nature, existing outside of time and space as beings projected into local space-time situations as part of a larger, evolving being in turn within all that is, the universe at large, or God. This all that is originally separated out into portions of itself. We, as those portions, look longingly and lovingly back at our source. At the same time, we glory in our unique individualities. We create our own reality by projecting energy outward to form the physical world, to which we then react and from which we learn and nurture both ourselves and the larger entities of which we are an aspect. Creative expression, for Seth, mirrors in our private realities the way the universe was and is constantly created. To create our personally experienced world, we must change ourselves in order to change what we express or project. Our beliefs act like hypnotists. As long as the particular directions are given, our experiences conform automatically. The idea of reincarnation is central to Seth material as well. While he sees us encompassing many physical embodiments as relatively immortal beings, his view is more complex than the traditional linear notion of reincarnation. From Seth's perspective, all is taking place simultaneously in an eternal and infinite now. Hence it is possible, as the multidimensional personalities that we each are, to affect our own past and future actual or probable selves by our here and now activity. The point of answer, as Seth puts it, is the experienced present. Skipping ahead. On an early September day in 1963, in her apartment in Elmira, New York, which is where that first interview was held, 34-year-old aspiring poet and novelist Jane Roberts first encountered channeling. It was to remain at the center of her life until her death in 1984. As she recalls, it was as if someone had slipped me an LSD cube on the sly. Having had no more than a couple of fleeting psychic experiences before then, she was overwhelmed by the new phenomenon. Quote, a fantastic avalanche of radical new ideas burst into my head with tremendous force, as if my skull were some sort of receiving station, turned up to unbearable volume. She found herself face to face with an adjacent level of reality, more real than the one she had known. Quote, it was as if the physical world were really tissue paper thin, hiding infinite dimensions of reality, and I was suddenly flung through the tissue paper with a huge ripping sound. And that huge ripping sound reappears in Oversoul 7 at numerous points. My body sat at the table, and my hands furiously scribbled down the words and ideas that flashed through my head. Her ideas about the nature of reality were turned upside down, as more than 100 pages of manuscript titled The Physical Universe as Idea Construction poured forth onto paper. And that was just her first book. She would channel, I'm not sure the actual number, but she was extremely prolific with it. So now, I'm gonna have us actually read it's just a few pages of introduction to The Nature of Personal Reality. This is one of the channeled books. And the subtitle is Specific Practical Techniques for Solving Everyday Problems and Enriching the Life You Know. So I printed out, it's the introduction and also a few pages of the channel text, two pages, just to give an indication of what that's like versus the Oversoul 7 fictional books. And as I mentioned a few weeks ago, the issue of like the relationship between fiction and reality is very much a major theme in the last works from the semester on the syllabus. So that's something that I definitely like to come back to today during our discussion. So on this printout, there's little caret marks on the side. Those are like when there's an open caret, like at the very top, that's where you start reading. And then I have like a closed caret where we're stopping. So we're not going to read. Does everyone see those? So we're not reading everything, just the parts that are blocked off. So I guess with Grace, let's start. You can just read a paragraph and then pass it on, and we can keep going around.
Am I starting with my idea?
I'm proud to publish. Did you see the open caret there?
No. Oh, look,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, okay.
So this is like the whole first page is what we're reading, and then the first closed caret is on the next page.
Oh.
And then we skip forward to there. It's cut off a little bit. So yeah, so after there I'll point towards where we start again. But for the time being, we can just read the first page.
I'm proud to publish this book under my own name, though I don't fully understand the mechanics of its production or the nature of the personality I assume in delivering it. I had no conscious work to do on the book at all. I simply went into trance twice a week, spoke in a mediumistic capacity for Seth, or as Seth, and dictated the words to my husband, Robert Butts, who wrote them down.
I consider the book mine, in that I don't believe it could have been written without me and my particular abilities. On the other hand, I realize that far more is involved. I had to read the manuscript to find out what was in it, for example, and to that extent the book doesn't seem mine. But what does that mean?
My idea briefly is this. Our usual orientation is focused pretty exclusively on what we think of as the real world. But there are many realities. By shifting our consciousness, we can glimpse these alternate realities, and all of them are the appearance that reality takes under certain conditions. I don't believe we can necessarily describe one in terms of another.
For years I have been confused, trying to define Seth in the usual true and false world of facts. There he is accepted as an independent spirit, a spirit guided by those with spiritualistic beliefs, or as some displaced portion of my own personality by the scientific community. I couldn't accept either idea, at least not in undiluted form.
If I said, look people, I don't think Seth is a spirit in the way you mean, then this was interpreted as an acknowledgement that Seth was only a portion of my personality. Some people thought I was trying to put Seth down or deny them the aid of a super being when at last they thought they found one.
Actually, I think that the selves we know in normal life are only the three-dimensional actualizations of other source selves from which we receive our energy and light. The reality can't be contained in the framework of our creaturehood, though it is being constantly translated for our present individual.
The spirit guide designation may be a handy symbolic representation of this idea, and I'm not saying that spirit guides do not exist. I am saying that the idea deserves greater examination, for the spirit guide may represent something far different than we think. The idea can also be limiting if it always places revelatory knowledge outside of us, and tries to make literal some extraordinary phenomena that may be beyond such interpretation.
While I was trying to define Seth that way and questioning whether or not he was a spirit guide, I was closed off to some extent from his greater reality, which exists in terms of vast imaginative and creative power that is bigger than the world of facts and can't be contained in it. Seth's personality is quite observable in our sessions, for example, but the source of that personality isn't. For that matter, the origin of any personality is mysterious and not apparent in the objective world. My job is to enlarge the dimensions of that world and people's concepts of it.
Seth's books may be the product of another dimensional aspect of my own consciousness, not focused in this reality, plus something else that is untranslatable in our terms, with Seth a greater psychic creation more real than any fact. His existence may simply lie in a different order of events than the one we're used to.
I'm not saying that we shouldn't apply what we learn to the ordinary world. Certainly I'm trying to do that, and Seth wrote this book to help people deal more effectively with their daily lives. I am insisting that we must be very careful about making literal interpretations, lest we limit a multidimensional phenomenon by tying it down to a three-dimensional fact system.
Intuitively and emotionally, we often understand more than we intellectually realize. Trying to define revelatory knowledge, or a Seth, in terms of our limited ideas about human personality is like trying to translate, say, a rose to the number 3, or trying to explain one in terms of another.
The funny thing is that a personality not focused on our reality can help people live in the world more effectively and joyfully by showing them that other realities also exist. In this book, Seth is saying that you can change your experience by altering your beliefs about yourself and physical existence.
To me, the Seth material is no longer a continuing manuscript of fascinating theories to be carefully judged against reality. In a strange way, it has come alive. The concepts within it live. I experienced them, and because of this, my personal reality has expanded. I began to glimpse the greater inner dimensions from which our usual lives emerge, and to familiarize myself with the other alternate methods of perception that can be used not only to see other worlds, but help us deal more effectively with this one.
While Seth was producing this book, my own life was immeasurably enriched in unforeseen ways. Frequent psychedelic-type experiences paralleled Seth's dictated material, and my own creative and psychic abilities developed into some entirely new areas.
Are we going over to
Yeah.
But beside this, as Seth was dictating his present book, I also found myself suddenly writing a novel, The Education of Oversoul Seven, which was produced more or less automatically. Oversoul Seven, the main character, achieved his own kind of reality. I'd say mentally, the case setting, let's have the next chapter, and there it was as quickly as I could write it down. Portions of the book also came in the dream state.
We know that Seven and his teacher Cypress exist in certain terms, yet their reality can't be explained either in the usual fact world. For example, the novel included many Sumeri poems and portions of speaker manuscripts, and when I sing Sumeri, I identify with Cypress, who is supposed to be a fictional character. I could also tune into Seven for help with personal challenges I discovered.
I love to go full blast ahead, using my abilities as freely as possible. Yet quite as strongly, I'm often scandalized intellectually by the same events that intuitively intrigue me, or by the interpretations placed upon them. It does no good to pretend otherwise, and I think there's a good reason for this sometimes uneasy blend of intuition and intellect.
I'm learning that both elements are important in my work and in Seth's, and perhaps my own refusal to accept pat answers leads me to search so intensely, and is responsible to some degree for my bringing in a Seth instead of a Mad Hatter.
And skip that next paragraph.
In the meantime, all I can say is this. We live in a world of physical facts, but these spring from a deeper realm of creativity, and in a real sense, facts are fictions that spring alive in our experience. All facts, Seth, then, is as much a fact as I am or you are, and in a strange way, he straddles both worlds. I hope that aspects will also span the world of facts and the rich inner realities from which they come, for our experience includes each.
The nature of personal reality not only enriched my creative life, but challenged my ideas and beliefs. I agree wholeheartedly with the concepts Seth presents here, while realizing that they run counter to many accepted religious, social, and scientific dogmas. Certainly, this book is an answer to all those who have written for help in applying Seth's ideas to ordinary living, and I am certain that it will assist many people in dealing with the varied events and problems of daily life.
Seth's main idea that we create our personality, our personal reality, through our conscious beliefs about ourselves, others, and the world. Following this, the concept that the point of power is in the present, not in the past, this life, or any other. He stresses the individual's capacity for conscious action and provides excellent exercises designed to show each person how to apply these theories to any life situation.
The message is plain. We are not at the mercy of the subconscious, or helpless before forces that we cannot understand. The conscious mind directs unconscious activity and has at its command all of the powers of the inner self. These are activated according to our ideas about reality. We are gods couched in creaturehood, Seth says, given the ability to form our experiences, our thoughts and feelings become actual.
Since the early days of our sessions, which began in late 1963, Seth has consistently called me Rupert and Rob, Joseph, saying that these names refer to the greater selves from which our present identities spring. He continues that practice in this book.
As usual, Rob methodically records each session in his own version of shorthand and then types it. This is much easier and faster than taping each session, replaying it, and then typing. Periodically, Rob notes the passage of time to show how long it takes us to get through a particular passage. Rob himself dictates the words to be underlined or put in quotes or parentheses. Often he indicates the placement of colons and other punctuation as well.
This book should help each reader understand the nature of private experience and use that knowledge to make daily living more creative and enjoyable.
So before we read the excerpt from Seth on the next page, I just want to point out that she wrote this on November 6th, 1973, and the Education of Oversoul Seven was originally published in 73. So this is about, the same time. And she mentioned that because what did she say about Oversoul Seven, the writing of that book in here?
That she wasn't doing it consciously, it kind of just flowed through her in dream states or in otherwise, they just came to her and she wrote it down.
Yeah, so it's what is the difference ultimately then between that and channeling a personality? Because it sounds like she, in a way, channeled the book from, she wasn't intentionally writing it, or she felt like she wasn't. But it is fictional, where she says that the Seth material is not fictional in the same way. So, and did anyone notice anything that resonated with our discussion about Jung from last week?
She says we're not at the mercy of our subconscious, but his whole idea, and so is Freud's, is that everything, our subconscious basically guides us, and eventually we'll find out what's guiding us. But her whole thing is that we make our own reality, but through our conscious mind.
Well, that, in a way that is similar to what Jung was saying, because Jung was positioning himself against Freud, who, Jung read Freud as saying that we were kind of the victims of our unconscious, and there were all of these untamable desires and, impulses that we had to repress and keep down. But she's saying, both her and Jung talk about how we work with our unconscious, that our unconscious is a part of us, and so there's not an inherent antagonism the way that there is in Freud. Did anything else stand out to anyone? What did you think of her description of her understanding of what Seth was? So on the first page, the first 2 pages, she's talking about how in the beginning, when this first started happening, she was really wrestling over putting a label on it of is this real? Is this not real? What's going on? But eventually she came to the understanding, so this is the last paragraph on that very first page. For years I've been confused, trying to define Seth in the usual true and false world of facts. There he's accepted as an independent spirit, a spirit guide by those with spiritualistic beliefs, or as some displaced portion of my own personality by the scientific community. So people in the New Age community would say Seth is literally this external spirit that she's channeling, and she's just a gateway or a pathway for that Seth personality to speak, and so the very literal sense. And then the scientists say this is just, a case of multiple personality disorder or some kind of dissociation, that you're putting yourself into this trance and part of your personality from within your own mind is coming out in this way. It's manifesting in this form. But she ultimately says that she found that, and it's similar to what Jung was saying about wrong images. There's these ideas that are the things that exist outside of our dimension or exist outside of our concepts and language, and that any type of language that makes sense to us will, by definition, not be able to capture the thing. So it goes back to our discussion of the thing in itself versus appearances. If every time we put a description onto it, it's inherently not the thing in itself. It's just our way of understanding something that exists beyond our ability to understand it completely. So, she leaves it up a little bit more up in the air in terms of, but she does feel that something is out there that she has access to. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the back page of the handout. So again, like you start with the within any given period in that paragraph.
Within any given 24-hour period, then, those season aspects of all of your other experiences appear in their own way. You each contain aspects of your other identities within your current selves. Some very obvious, perhaps, and others barely noticeable. Abilities focused upon in one life may be recognized as your own now, for example, but not strongly utilized.
And then down to skip a paragraph.
Each day, therefore, is an incarnation, so to speak, but not only symbolically, for through soul's intersection with the flesh, each self mirrors daily its reincarnational or simultaneous selves.
Although you are an individual and with free will, you are also part of another you. You simply do not identify with your greater self now. You have your own unique characteristics. Your greater being also possesses its own originality, yet there will be what you may think of as a family resemblance, and so overall you and your other self often choose the same kinds of challenges, if in dissimilar ways.
In their own ways, other portions of your multidimensional being are involved in experiences then, somewhat similar to your own, though on the outside the situation may be completely different. Their progress lies latent within the window of the moment point, the moment point simply being your current intersection with the reality that you know.
The adventures of your simultaneous selves, again, appear as choices in your own consciousness, as ideas or daydreams or disconnected images, or sometimes even in sudden intuitions. They can be drawn out, to help you understand current problems.
Now, this does not mean that you will necessarily have a flood of reincarnational information, instant intuitive recognition of past lives, or experience any such intrusive data. It does mean that in your own life, such information automatically appears in intimate ways, but couched within the framework of your own comprehensions, even passing unobtrusively through your conscious thoughts.
Many artists unknowingly paint portraits of their simultaneous selves. Many mothers find themselves feeling younger than their offspring at times, or about to call some of their children by different names. Impulses to try activities you have not tried before may indeed be messages from other portions of your own being.
And then, Colin, could you read the footnote there?
Sure. I feel that I am such an artist. For some related material, so-and-so, chapter 20 of Seth speaks. It's enough to say here that it wasn't until after these sessions began in 1963 that I realized my inner mottos were quite as valid as those who physically sat before me. Indeed, I often saw the former with a clearer vision. But my early training and work as a commercial artist, beginning in New York City in 1939, conditioned me to believe that the artist was supposed to deal only with what he could see, objectively. For many years, I ignored the fact that in grade school I'd very happily and freely covered my yellow tablets with drawings of imaginary people and places.
Great, thank you. So, what major ideas come up here? Because basically, in the channeled material, she's talking about the ideas sort of abstractly, like in general, these are the principles and what happens and how consciousness works and how reality is ordered. But then in the Oversoul 7 trilogy, the Education of Oversoul 7, it's like a particular like example, instantiation of the ideas that are expressed. And I'd really like to, your paper topic is perfect here because Grace wrote her midterm about, I don't know if you remember when we were looking at the thesis statements on the board, but she talked about how the ways that narrative gets ideas across differently than just saying the ideas. And so this is like a prime example of her trying to get the ideas across through the use of narrative, where instead of like having to memorize information, like you learn alongside the characters as they discover the truth of the ideas. So what stood out in this section? Was there anything that resonated with anything you read in Oversoul 7?
The interconnection between different selves, is really apparent in Oversoul 7. When one character is dreaming about a certain thing, it kind of bleeds over into the other characters' lives, and this is kind of what she's talking about when she's saying, like, artists paint portraits of their simultaneous selves.
Yeah, so even though she doesn't use explicitly the word bleed through here, like that's exactly what she's describing. Like when people have intuitions or daydreams or some image randomly pops into their head, it could be because some connected personality in another space-time is going through that or thinking about that or exposed to that at the moment.
So, like the last paragraph on this page 381, that reminded me of when Oversoul 7 was supposed to like identify the most he could with like Ma'a or whatever, and got stuck in her body. But then Cypress explained to him like your characters are like a lot of themselves, like they're not only you, and like I don't know. That's kind of explaining what Cypress explained.
Yeah, so all of
he's like only a little part of them.
Yeah, and but they're all connected and they share something in common, but they're also all individual and all have their own kinds of free will. So eventually in our discussion, I'd like to talk about like this model versus, or in relation to Hinton, who talked about some similar ideas relating to free will and our connection to like a higher oversoul type being. Anything else about anything we read here?
Yeah, I think that distinction about the free will and the interference of past lives is really hard to make in here, though, because in contrast to some of the other readings that we have, here she says she doesn't really put consciousness and unconsciousness as separate things, and she says what you encounter in your life, like feelings, that intrusive data, that flood of reincarnational information will just appear to you as something very normal. So you're not even going to realize it. That's basically what she's, I think, saying in that paragraph that starts with now, under the middle part of 382. So I think she's trying to say that those interventions are not always going to be clear to you.
Yeah.
So I don't know how to frame it, but it's really hard to make the distinction between what's real consciousness, what's real free will, and what's something that's being fed to you.
And there's further layers of complication because there's our consciousness, like our ego personality consciousness that we're aware of in the moment, but then there's also like we can have like higher self consciousness that leads us towards like certain life conflicts that we need to get through in order to move on to our like next stage of self-awareness that like we don't consciously think about, but like some part of us does. So it's like it's complicated by the fact that there's not just one level of conscious awareness. There's like different.
So it gets really hard to define that. Is that free will or not? It's really hard to understand.
And we'll look at some of the discussions because there's a lot of attempts to explain free will and time in the Oversoul 7 book. So let's definitely keep that as an open question and like look at some of the passages from here as we get to it. And Jane, do you have something?
I was going to talk for a second about the whole free will thing.
Yeah.
It was very confusing to me because especially a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about, when we're talking about timeless beings that are not like bound by space and times, a lot of times the conclusion that they draw is that because things are timeless, then this means that the events of an individual's life have already happened, so therefore there is no free will, essentially, which is what was in Slaughterhouse 5 and a lot of what Hinton talked about. So it was hard for me to combine both the ideas that every single individual has a free will, yet they're also combined with some kind of an oversoul in which all the events in their life have already taken place, if that makes sense. And I didn't know if I don't think that's exactly what she was trying to say, but that got a little bit lost.
I don't think they ever said that all the events had taken, like the only like I remember when he said at one point that he like projected into the future that this one item would be important. Like Cypress said that that was just like one probable future if they chose to like make it that way. So there are like kind of these like destined paths that they could take, but it's like at any point in their life that individual could choose to like alter either their past or their present or their future path. And so like the fact that there are many paths implies that there could be like infinite paths, and so like
But at the same time, the main character, 7, is described as a timeless being. and at the same time, like that time perception of something happened.
But he's not the like individual personalities though. He's like the greater.
But my whole thing was, I mean, this is where a lot of my confusion came from, is let's say you have one of the 7 selves living in the 19th century and then another one living in whenever it was, the
17th century. Yeah.
No, like, let's say farther ahead, like the person living in the future. I don't remember exactly what the year was.
Century.
Were they, to me, that suggested that the events in the person who's living in the 19th century's life would have already happened in the person who's living in the future and in their life, which would mean that they're not like necessarily growing simultaneous, but that like
there's nothing probable left about the
right. That's what I'm saying. It seemed to me that in order to have like future selves, that means that these past selves would then have already had to have been completed.
But there's an explicit
part.
Yeah.
Or did you get to chapter 17? Like, it's just like later on.
It like lays all of that out
like
explicitly.
Yeah, because
let's turn to page 132 actually, like these pictures. Because they explicitly go through, like, Seven himself is like, what? I don't understand, like, how all this is working, and Cypress is trying to, like, guide him through it. And she's not really, she's sort of, like, encouraging him to figure it out. Yeah, she's not, like, sitting there lecturing at him, but actually, like, trying to lure it out. Because ultimately, like, the thing that sets this conversation, or that really piques this conversation about free will and the relationship between the time frames of the different personalities, is that there's one moment where Proteus is looking at these tiles that are ancient tiles that Ma'a, the like past personality, was existing with those tiles back in prehistoric times, and they're both in the same place looking at the tiles but at different times. So like, 2300 and then like, BC time or whatever the first one is. And there's a moment where and I'll find the page
where she writes her name down.
Yeah, she writes her name on one of the tiles, and then suddenly it appears for Proteus in the future, and he's like, wait a minute, that wasn't there a second ago. And then a window who's with him says, well, either we had to have not seen it, or someone had to have written it since we were gone and came back again. But then Proteus is like, no, that's definitely, look at it, it's really old. It's been, he's sure it wasn't there. And then, but it looks like it's been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so then Seven gets really tripped out by this and is like, but wait a minute, like, if that happened in the past, shouldn't it have been there already by Proteus's time? Shouldn't he have seen it to begin with? Why did it suddenly appear? And then they start explaining how the nature of time, they are all the personalities are existing simultaneously. And so if you change the course of action of a past person, it also simultaneously changes the future path of the future personality. So it's not a determined linear timeline. And so that's why that page 136, he's trying to work it out, and so Seven's projecting these images on the sky like a giant blackboard, and he's really, or chalkboards, like he's really proud of himself because he thinks that's like riffing off of the trope of the examination by writing it up on the sky as if it's like a chalkboard. So he's saying here that you have past time, present time, future time, but then each of those time frames fractal out into all of their possibilities. So the past has its own present, past, and future. The present has present, past, and future, and the future has present, past, and future. And there's all of these possibilities existing simultaneously in a higher dimension, but that the power of consciousness, like with the, what's that wave?
Double slit experiment.
Yeah, the double slit. Yeah.
Thinking.
So
it collapses sort of into one reality.
Can you explain the double slit experiment?
Yeah, it's it's like a new metaphysical experiment that they've been conducting with light, where like light, propagates through the ether as a wave. But what they found was when they were studying the waves of the technology they have to observe it, they realized that depending on depending on how they were looking at it, it would either be a wave or a bunch of particles. but like they would look at the same thing at the same time and get two different results depending upon like their angle. So it is simultaneously a wavelength and also like a bunch of particles broken up. Like the wavelength would be like one holistic thing, and then the particles would be, just fragments of it.
Well, so the wave is like the probability that like a particle would be like at a certain place at a certain time, and it's not until you actually measure the particle that it appears in a particular place. It's like a probability field until you have an observer looking at it, and then it zeroes down into a point. And actually Kaku talks about this a bit in his hyperspace book, where you can view the whole universe as a probability field. And so there's a small probability, he says, that we could just fall through the floor at any given moment. But the chance of that happening is so small that it's a smaller probability than like the age of the universe itself. So it's unlikely to happen. But there's always these like slight probabilities of differences happening. And it's consciousness focusing on something that causes one probability to emerge into an actuality out of the sea of like potential states. And so so if we look at, because does anyone remember where that, the tile, where Proteus is looking at the tile?
Oh, he finds it on page 129.
Could you read just that section, or like the part where Window is saying, yeah, because on page 130, the very top, it says, Window said, either the mark was there and we didn't see it, or it was put there while we were gone, and in such a way that it appears old. The first explanation is certainly the more reasonable one. And then Proteus says, I don't care, it makes me uneasy. This arouses my curiosity more than any demonstration of your abilities or stories, just because it happened to me, I suppose. So just to back up a little bit, who is Proteus, who is Story, and who is Window? And actually, I want to take a quick break to put our group discussion in between here, because I was gonna and we'll come back to this discussion. But for the group discussion, I'm going to split you into two groups. So, just I guess, you guys can go that way and that way. And for you all, I'm going to ask these questions and I'll write them up on the board, so you don't have to, worry about remembering them. But firstly, what do we know about each of Oversoul Seven's personalities? In what ways are they the same, and in what ways do they differ? And I'm going to ask you, this group, to focus on Ma and Joseph, and this group to focus on Lydia and Proteus. So try to come up with, like, based on what you've read, like, what are they like? How are they similar? How are they different? Because ultimately, like, they're all connected to Seven, and they keep saying over and over again that Seven's personality characteristics permeate into his various personalities. So they have to be similar in some respects, but they're also individuals, and so they're different. So so let's get to that for like 5-10 minutes, and then come back to, and I'll write the questions up here. So let's start with the first pair of characters. I'm just briefly looking at the back of the book, because it says here, right, what the characters are. Doesn't it?
No.
It doesn't. I guess not. So who is Ma? That's your group?
Yeah.
Your group. Okay.
Ma is a black girl in 35,000 BC who's just like surviving against nature with her like mate of survival who's named Rampa, and she's very intuitive, and she has the capability of being smart, but she like never has it really developed because she's just like always having to face death and like survival, and then when she gets introduced into like that society of the speakers, she finds out that she like learns things really fast and picks up, and she has like a really good sense of like self and like self-entitlement. She has like a lot of childish qualities to her too, but she's very like, I think that gives her strength and like learning and like being into things.
Mm-hmm. Had we talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs before in this class? Has anyone heard of that? You have, right? You took psychology. Can you explain it?
So it starts off, it's a pyramid, and it starts off with basic needs, and then the very top level is actualization.
Yeah.
And so it's saying that, like, if you don't have your basic needs, then you can't focus on, I think there's, like, social needs, like the desire to, like, belong to a group. I'm not explaining it very well, but it's just basically, if she doesn't have her basic needs covered, she can't focus on any higher aspects of her personality.
Yeah, exactly. So you can't really, like, explore deep, like, philosophical truths about the universe or about your true nature, who you are, philosophical concepts, and developing your emotions deeply if every day you're spending all of your time trying to survive, hunting, trying not to freeze, trying to find shelter. And so for the first part of the book, before she moves into a more secure foundation, she is sort of just at a subsistence level of, getting by from one day to the next.
What was that pyramid called again?
Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah, I'll write it up here, actually. Was that all you had for Ma?
Yeah, well, then we have, like, things for how they're similar and different, but just, like, as a singular character.
And so what's your basic description of Joseph, then?
So he's a painter in the 17th century. He's self-important. He doesn't manage his responsibilities very well. He isn't able to think about consequences very well.
He doesn't feel inspired, but he really wants to be a painter. And, like, he is a painter.
It's kind of lazy.
It's kind of what?
Yeah. Lazy.
Oh, lazy, yeah.
He's searching for these moments of inspiration, because when he has an inspirational kick, he'll just obsessively paint for a really long time. But when he doesn't have good, like, self-discipline aside from sparks of inspiration. Like, he's the type of person that will sit around and wait for inspiration to strike rather than diligently practice his craft. And can someone explain briefly how he ended up at the house that he's at and what he's doing there?
He was commissioned to do a portrait of some sort for the family.
So he was a kind of roving, painter. Like, he would move around, go to festivals in the summer and paint for people and sell his paintings. And so he came across this farmhouse, says, like, if you put me up, feed me, I will make portraits of you. But then what happens at that point?
He's doing nothing. So they're like, you have to get out, and then he gets the inspiration from Seven and makes a beautiful picture of the barn or whatever, the house, I guess.
But then what happens to that painting?
He destroys it.
He destroys it in a fit of... And then what happens after he destroys it?
He tries to run away, and then they catch up to him, and they, like, take him back, and they board up all the windows and say, like, we won't feed you until we see progress on this painting, and, like, you're not leaving here, like, we don't want you to go to jail, but you can't get off, like, scot-free, so...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so... Definitely, I would say self-important, narcissistic. Even, like, the family talks about how they're not real to him except for means to his own ends. Like, they're caricatures of people, and he doesn't really see them as human beings. Like, they're just, like, pawns in his own self-important life path. At least in the beginning, and there's development of the character, but that's how he's set up for... the first hundreds or so pages. Yeah, it's like he lives in his own world completely. And so it's interesting, because what does Seven say about Joseph?
He gets himself in needless trouble.
But he explicitly says also that Joseph is the one that he identifies with the most.
Yeah.
Which is, like, interesting, because he's I would say... by far worst character in the book. He's, like, grungy, just likes to use people, doesn't care. He almost reminds me of a junkie in terms of, like, the way he's willing to just
But it makes you think that Seven himself, like, doesn't realize these qualities in himself because he's always being, like, telling him, like, stop getting into trouble, like, why can't you just do these things? And, like, yeah, he admits, like, that he identifies with him, so just, like, saying that he, like, has these things that he also, like, wouldn't characterize of himself.
Super manipulative, too.
Yeah,
He knows how to, like,
extremely.
work the family for a long time there.
And is willing to just sleep with the daughter and then discard her, and at least in the beginning part of the book. So what is the relationship? How do Ma and Joseph? How are they similar and different to each other?
We said that they're similar because they're the ones who've primarily seen Seven in dreams. Ma has seen him as an old man, and Joseph has also seen him as an old man, but then that one time in the beginning as a young boy, whereas Lydia and Proteus never really acknowledged him in dreams or, like, connect with him in that way. They both have a sense of, like, self-importance, too, because, like, Ma, when she's learning this stuff, she's like, stop making fun of me. That's also, like, the childish thing of, like, always trying to, like, self-importance, and we just said that Joseph has that.
So sort of rebellious, too, and stubborn, definitely, as qualities. And just, let's look briefly at the top of page 14. This is where Seven and Cypress are talking. Seven says, Ma always sees me as an old man, Seven sighed. Come to think of it, she sees me as black because she's black. Joseph sees me in lots of different ways, but he likes to see me as an old man too. It gives him confidence in me for some silly reason. So in that, like, the idea that identity filters perception, or that you'll interpret things through the lens of what you know, has come up a lot in our previous readings. And also when, like in Contact, when Ellie is talking to the alien who appears as her father, because that's what she knows. So, you know, Seven doesn't appear to them in any kind of ultimate form, but as, you know, they are capable of experiencing him, or based on what they expect. Anything else in terms of the contrast?
We also said that, so, like, Ma, because she needs to stay alive, but also maybe that's because of who she is much more, like, intuitive and, like, kind of knows what to do and, like, doesn't, like, Joseph just, like, sits around looking for stuff and, like, hoping that it'll hit him, and then every time that Seven makes it hit him, he's like, oh, I got it, and then he just, like, loses it.
Yeah, that's a good point. So Mom's pretty curious and pretty, like, self-motivated in terms of, like, you know, wanting to explore, wanting to learn, whereas we don't really see Joseph ever push himself outside of his boundaries. It's like he has this idea of who he is and what he's supposed to do, and he's not at all interested in thinking about anything else or anyone else's perspective. So that's great. And then how about for Lydia and Proteus?
You said that they're both similar to the other characters. They're both, like, headstrong and stubborn.
But could you describe them individually first, so we make sure everyone has, like, a understanding? So what is the time? What are the time period differences between them?
So Proteus is in, like, the 23rd century in the future, and he's living in this, like, synthetic universe above the Earth. And at first, the first time we're, like, introduced to him is when he's, like, commenting on the rain and how it comes at a uniform time every day, and it's boring, and everything's plastic, and it's made to, like, he explains his universe and how he's wishes he could just be in, like, the wild, natural Earth. So then he leaves kind of haphazardly. He's, like, running with his friend and then says, like, let's race home, and then instead he goes and, like, drops down into Earth.
It almost reminded me of, like, The Giver. Has anyone read The Giver? How it's this, you know, very ordered, sterile, utopian society, but that at the expense of
color.
color.
Yeah, like he says at one point that like he wonders what it would be like when all the people were different colors and
because
all of that.
Everyone's the same skin tone. The rain is pre-programmed. All of the plants are plastic. Yeah.
3.2 degrees.
Yeah, and he's like childish too because he's like kind of like fighting with his dad at first too about this, and his dad's like, "Can you just like stop asking these questions and like deal with it or whatever?" But he's like a very like stubborn kid and kind of rebellious.
And is Lydia stubborn and rebellious?
She's definitely rebellious.
She's very also resolute in her own beliefs. She's not very willing to kind of accept like new bouts of information, and she's definitely the least willing of the four to kind of accept this outside Seven figure. She always denounced it as like, "Oh, I had weird dreams last night," whereas the other three are a little bit more intuitive in terms of understanding.
And the whole thing when Lawrence died too, she was like, "I don't believe in reincarnation at all. Like that doesn't happen." But then like she said multiple times that like Lawrence like he's dead, but like he's definitely the one talking to her, and like she knows he's there. So it's like she kind of makes it fit her, like what she wants.
She's also a lot more rational compared to Proteus. So for example, Proteus is this kid acting a lot with his emotions or his instincts, and Lydia doesn't have that much of an emotion when she's planning her new like life. If Lawrence passes away, she cleans out the fridge, puts something on the table, throws away the body, and just eats, for example. And just keeps going on.
So yeah, let's just give like a brief overview of what Lydia, because what's going on in the beginning of the book with Lydia and Lawrence.
They're going on this trip in a trailer.
Yeah, so she's an old woman, and she has a slightly younger male friend that they decide to buy an RV, take the goldfish, the cat. Were there two cats or just one cat? Two cats. And so it's this like happy family, and they have this pact between them. Does anyone remember what the pact is?
That like if one of them dies or like something happens, you just continue on, and like no like giving up or giving it back or like funerals or anything like that.
And Lydia, I believe, said also they didn't want to live in like any kind of derelict state. Like they wanted to sort of like...
Oh, like, yeah, if one of them gets like Alzheimer's, then the other one should like shoot them.
Yeah. Yeah, so they didn't want any kind of funeral, and they didn't want to live attached to like hospital machinery, and so they were going to go as long as they could. And they were going to a book reading, I believe, that Lydia was at some Ohio college, I think. She was giving a book reading, and then suddenly she calls to, first Lawrence from the back. She's driving, Lawrence is in the back. Lawrence asks how the goldfish...
stroke first.
She does, and she tries not to hide it.
Yeah.
But Seven sort of appears, because he gets called to his personalities often when they're having trouble, and he helps them out in those moments. And so he helps her kind of like hold on through that stroke, because she'd had a series of strokes before, and that one, like, you know, she could have died potentially at that moment, but she got through it. And then, so Lawrence is in the back seat. He asks her, like, oh, how's the goldfish doing? Because they check on it periodically to make sure it hasn't, like, sloshed out of the bowl. And that's the last thing she hears from him. And it's getting to be dinner time. She's like, oh, should we stop? Should I pull off here? Silence from the back, silence. So eventually she keeps talking to him, but then pulls over the car into the side of the highway and then goes and checks on him. And that is a doornail in the back. And so which shocked her because, you know, they had these grand plans. She assumed she was going to go first because she was sickly and old. He was young, but just suddenly had a heart attack in the back. And so if we turn to page 73, this is the part where Lawrence has just died, but then she hears a voice, Lawrence speaking to her supposedly, but she doesn't believe, as we were saying, she doesn't believe in life after death. And then, so on the top of page 73, Lawrence says to her, what would you rather believe, he asked, and suddenly she didn't care if she was crazy or not, or what was happening. For all she knew, maybe she was just having a nightmare. All right, she said aloud. What's next on the agenda? The sweetness of madness, she thought, the freedom. She'd just go along. What else could she do? Lawrence was there. Somehow he was going to help her figure out what to do with his body. She couldn't just cart it around forever. It would be a terrible nuisance. So what from last week was similar to that paragraph?
I like the accepting of like madness and what seems like it's unreal and impossible is actually like helps you deal with your reality better.
And do you remember the books on the bookshelf when the dead friend appears to Jung?
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone remember that section? What happens in that?
I remember he had a dream that he was in his friend's library where he hadn't been before, and he went to a specific book, looked at a specific book on the shelf, and then he woke up and he went to do it, and he looked where he had been looking, but I forget what the book was.
It was something to do with death. I forget the exact title of it, but he wasn't exactly dreaming. Like he was in his room, like in bed or something, and he had this sense that his friend appeared to him. It was in the room, and he had this dialogue with himself where he was like, but surely he couldn't actually be here. But then he thought to himself, well, it would be foolish of me if he actually did come to visit me for me not to pay attention to him just because I didn't think it was possible. So I'm just going to play along with this because what other options do I have, really? And so that's it's the decision to play along, because she says explicitly, she'd just go along. That's a kind of just like the experiment of like, well, even though I don't really believe in this or this isn't supposed to be happening, I'm just going to see where it leads to and what happens. And then one of my favorite lines in the whole book, when I got to this line, I was just like, yes, is after the second paragraph, so the third paragraph, the readers never got a chance to know you at all, she said suddenly. What readers? What are you talking about? Lawrence said. I don't know. It just slipped into my mind, she said. But what are we going to do now? Because who are the readers? We are the readers. This is a moment where the book, like, the wall falls down, and it's like, oh, but we're part of it too, and we're in this other dimension looking in. So the way that, like, thoughts slip into people's heads where even she doesn't even know what she means by it. So, it's a moment of kind of dramatic irony in the sense that, like, we as the readers reading it realize who she's talking about, but she herself does not know. So I just like that part.
Yeah, it took me a couple times to get that. I was like, wait, what is she talking about? And I was like, oh.
Yeah, I was real pleased when I got to that line. It's like,
do you watch the show Community?
No.
They just do that a lot where they'll say, like, if we were a TV show and people were watching us, like, it's similar.
Yeah. And so were you going to say other stuff about the characters? Because I kind of jumped in there. Or did
that pretty much summed it up.
I mean, both a little bit cynical and disillusioned kind of with the world around them. Lydia more so in like a kind of tired state of living, and Proteus obviously much more being like, I want to experience the real world and I don't like this uniformity and homogeneity in this society and stuff. And I guess he hates that he's a boy.
Yeah, and why had like the Ohio thing too, because Lydia was like traveling through Ohio, and then Proteus lived in like the Ohio.
Yeah, exactly. So it's one of the bleed through moments where like equality from one life like reappears in another personality's life. And so why does he like being a boy matter?
Because the women their education is much more valued and they have a lot more opportunities in terms of occupations and intellectual endeavors, which is kind of, I guess, like the reverse of the majority of our history.
Yeah, so in his lifetime in the future, the women do all the meaningful jobs and the men stay home, take care of the kids, and they don't do any of the kind of intellectual or governmental type jobs. But does Jane Roberts depict that as a positive thing? No, and why do you say no?
Because I think at one point they mentioned that like like they say it explicitly, like the women in trying to like overcome all the inequalities that they had just like eventually started taking on all of those like same attributes that were negative about the men having power, and like it became again a non-functioning society because like it still was never equal.
And
when they should have been
society.
fighting for equality instead of like over equality.
Exactly. So actually, let's look at this on page 62, the bottom of that page. Window is talking to Proteus. "Wait now," Window said. "Proteus, listen to me for a moment. When the women took over, they tried to emphasize physical agility, strength, boldness, logic, all the qualities that men insisted were prerogatives of the male in the past. They minimized some other excellent characteristics because they erroneously considered them beneath their new status and a threat to it. They tried to ignore the intuitive understanding with which they were basically gifted, for example. So there were many quite normal human abilities that you're probably prejudiced against because of your background." And then he says, "But I'm very open-minded," Proteus objected. And then Window continues, "What about seeing into the future, into the past, or reading minds? Just before the massive takeover by the women, scientists were realizing that such things were quite possible. The world was at a point of new discovery." And he breaks off. So it's kind of related to the idea of, there's first wave feminism, which is like the idea that the original feminists just kind of took on the male traits to say, like, but we can be men too. And, like, that's the whole point of, like, the business shoulder pads and stuff to, like, but then, like, subsequent waves of feminism said, like, no, we don't have to be like men in order to be equal and worthwhile. And so, like, there can be traits that women and men, have differently across the spectrum, but that doesn't mean that one is inherently less worthwhile than the other. And so, it's maintaining the disequilibrium and, overemphasis on some things and suppression of other things that is still an inherently sick or unbalanced society. So it's not meant to be the idea that, like, this is how women are supposed to be in charge and we're going to move to this utopian future state where things are going to be like they're supposed to be. So it's just like a warning that it can equally well go in the other direction. So let's just take a brief break here, and then we'll continue finishing up with talking about the different personalities together and also how they relate to Seven overall.